there, Banditos. Welcome to the Wednesday episode of the Dollar Bin Bandits. I'm Mike Farah, and we have a great one for you today. His name is Matt Wagner, writer, artist, creator, such characters as Grendel and Mage. So we talk a lot about his formative years and getting those two books on the ground and keeping them going. We talk a lot about his work with other publishers like DC and Dynamite on mostly pulp heroes such as Batman, the Shadow, the Spirit, Green Hornet, and Zorro. Get a little bit into the Demon. And then we move into his current projects with Kelley Jones, this sort of magnum opus about Dracula. There are going to be four graphic novels in total. Two of them have been crowdfunded through Kickstarter already. The second should be in your mailboxes, I guess, any day now. And we talk about, what went into those books, what we can expect on the final two, and what else Matt's got working on. So without further ado, this is Matt Wagner. To welcome Matt Wagner to the program. Matt, thanks for being on.
You bet. Thanks for having me, man. Happy to be here.
Great. We're going to kick you off with our typical first question. I almost want to say patented, but it's so generic it cannot be patented, which is did you first discover comic books?
Oh, well, my mom was an English teacher. And so she always, who quit teaching to be a mom. But you never really lose that instinct. And she always pushed and encouraged me to read, to read, to read, to read, to read. And I did it. I took to it hard. Our local library in the small town I lived in had a summer reading program for kids where if you read 10 books, you got a certificate with 10 gold stars on it. I would usually get two or three of them every summer. Um, and I was an only child. I was born kind of late in my parents' life, and they had built a retirement home and kind of moved out in the country. So I grew up kind of all by myself out in the country. And this is before the days of much video entertainment. We had a black and white TV that I think got four stations. And so I drew to entertain myself. And comics were both reading and drawing all in one gorgeous little package. And unlike a lot of the English teachers of her day, she didn't mind that I was reading comic books so long as I was reading. She thought I'd grow out of them. But through comics, she also exposed me to a lot of the world's great literature because when I was a kid, so this is probably I was probably 7 or 8, between 7 and 10, let's say. So that would have been 68 to 70. When you were checking out at the grocery store, at the point of purchase there, where now it's like People Magazine and all that shit, they would have a rack of Classics Illustrated comics, and she would buy me those all the time. So my first exposure to Shakespeare, Robert Louis Stevenson, Charles Dickens, Alexander Dumas, the list goes on and on and on. Um, and I just my parents were, again, I was an only child, so they were fairly indulgent about buying me comics. In those days, I mainly liked DC comics because, again, I lived kind of out, I don't want to call it the middle of nowhere, but small town life.
Mm.
And so, all I had was a spinner rack at the local drugstore. And I didn't like Marvel comics because I didn't have regular access to everything. So the stories would not finish in each issue. So kind of a bizarre irony that I would later grow up to write these long, epic, many chapters spanning epics myself. But I was mainly a DC fan because you could read it and it would wrap up in one issue for the most part. So that's where my loyalties lay at that stage in my life.
And were you a collector right off the bat, or were these reader copies and tossed around and
Well, there really
copy
wasn't
that?
that preciousness.
Yeah.
I just shared with some friends of mine. Who I have a texting loop. We send each other shit all the time. Some photo from back in the '70s of some teenage guy like laying on his bed, and there's literally stacks of comics everywhere
Right.
around. 2 feet high, and that's the way my room was. And it just struck me the irony of how organic that felt, and how he feels so immersed in this world of comic books. Whereas if you look at a collector today, everything's fucking hermetically sealed and in boxes and in bags, and you have to go through a process just to access the comic book. Whereas for me, it was just flipping through stacks, and finding stuff. So the whole idea of keeping stuff in mint condition and bagging things and boarding things didn't really exist when I was coming up. Of course, you didn't want your stuff to be beat up and look like shit, but you also the main thing was to get your hands on it and read it over and over and over again, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I guess the main thrust behind that question, and a lot of folks we talk to take it that way in sort of like the more collector bag and board type um, version is more or less like, did you kind of
Yes,
read
I
them
wanted as
around
many
and then
comic books
throw
as
them
I could
out?
get
Did
my
they
hands
eventually
on.
get thrown out, or did you really
No,
like
no,
keep
no,
them and read them over and over again?
yeah, no,
That sort of collector
yeah, no, never threw anything out,
mentality.
and I wanted as
Yeah,
many comics as I could get my hands on.
right.
We lived near a big at one point we lived near a big indoor farmers market that was inside a big giant long Quonset hut. And when I say farmers market, there were produce and food stands and all that, but then, kind of flea markety sort of stands as well inside. And inevitably, there was a magazine stand. And this was back in the days when everything was returnable. So
Mm,
uh, vendors, instead of sending the whole book back to get a refund, would tear off just the top third, the title.
right.
And so then somebody got their hands on all those comics that had the logo ripped off. And that wasn't ideal. Of course, I wanted the comic to be whole, but if I could get my hands on more comics for, a third of the cost, because again, I was concerned with reading them. It was the
Yeah.
story that mattered to me more than anything else. So I had a ton of comics that were of that nature, that had the top third of the cover ripped off.
Yeah. But they're just as precious to you because, of
Yeah,
course, it's the story inside,
yeah,
right? It's the
yeah,
narrative.
yeah. Yeah,
Um,
and occasionally I'd be able to fill in a chapter of, some story that I was missing part three of, that sort of thing. So
right. And and was it right off the bat when you started thinking about or even making your own comics or even just starting to draw and copy what you saw?
I copied a lot. I did a couple of school projects. I did my first comic was a comic called Granite Man. Excuse me, I'm just getting over a cold. It was about a guy that created these wristbands that made his fists rock hard, granity, and he could fly for some fucked up reason. And so I wrote and drew that and stapled it together myself. Then when I was about 12 or 13, my dad had they had a Xerox machine where he worked. So I did a comic, and my poor long-suffering dad ran it all off on Xeroxes for me, so I had multiple copies and stapled them together. But I had no illusions of or even long-standing wishes to be a comic book artist because it seemed impossible. In those days, there was no overnight delivery, no overnight mail delivery of any kind. Um, And so you had to live near New York. That's where all the publishers were. You had to live in, Jersey or Philadelphia or Connecticut because you would take the train into the offices and physically pick up your jobs. And then you'd go home and you'd do your job and you'd bring it back in physically on the train. And I didn't live near New York, so that just seemed out of the question to me. Um, I knew I wanted to be in the arts. At one point, I went to art school to be an illustrator. I thought I would be a commercial illustrator of some kind, and it was there that I met the guys that ultimately formed Comico, my first publishing company. And this was in the early days of the indie comics boom. At that point, the prime examples were Cerebus from Dave Sim, ElfQuest from Richard and Wendy Pini, and then Mike Friedrich was doing a anthology book called Star Reach that was
Yeah.
are black and white. Those are the earliest stabs at doing independent comics. And all of a sudden, when the direct sales market crept up, when all of a sudden you didn't have to print enough books to have some of them returned to you, when it was pay to play, the retailer ordered as many books as they wanted and they thought they could sell, and there was no returning them to the publisher. All of a sudden, the prospect of being an independent publisher was a viable idea. Um, so it wasn't until I went to school in Philadelphia, which was near enough to New York, that I met these guys who were somewhat familiar with the industry and had this dream of starting an independent publishing company. And it was fits and starts to begin with, and a bunch of stupid kids stumbling their way through everything. And of course, we missed the big black and white boom by several years. We were a little too early for that, but it eventually all worked out in the end. But yeah, originally I didn't live in New York, so I couldn't be a comic book artist.
Yeah, I mean, back in those days, it really was proximity to New York, which was
Yep,
the center of the entire comic book universe. We've heard that story before. It's like basically if you really wanted to become a comic book professional, you had to move. No matter
yeah,
where you were in the
yep,
country, you basically had to move to New York,
yep.
and that was just it. That was the only way. Um, so so Comico was sort of forming, and I know your first book basically there introduced your, you know, primary character Grendel. Which came first? I mean, did you have Grendel somewhere in your back pocket before this whole
No,
thing with
no. What came
Comico came about?
what came first was an early aborted version of Mage, actually.
Okay.
I had an idea to do a thing about the return of King Arthur, and thank God it didn't work out because it was much more ordinary, much less interesting. Uh, it was set in a kind of apocalyptic future, and the guy wore a cape, and I mean, it was just extremely stereotypical in so many ways. And I had produced a couple pages of it, and then DC announced they were doing Camelot 3000, and I was like, well, there goes that idea, and yeah, that Brian Bolland guy draws a little better than I do.
Yeah, it's tough to
And it
compete
was
right
about
out
this
of the
time that
gate.
Comico was kind of trying to put together their initial launch of four black and white titles, and I was lucky enough that I was kind of part of the crowd, and they offered me one. And my thing was to try and come up with an anti-hero. There really weren't any of those, or not many of them in comics in those days. Um, I was greatly inspired by the works of Michael Moorcock, specifically the Elric cycle. Elric's a character that's kind of like was created as kind of the antithesis of Conan, so set in a fantasy universe, and rather than being this tough as nails barbarian who relies on his common sense and the strength of his arms, and has a great distrust of sorcery. Elric's the exact opposite. He's a weak albino from a dying aristocratic line, and he depends on drugs and sorcery as the source of his strength,
Mhm.
and ultimately gains this mystical cursed longsword called Stormbringer. That's actually a demon in the form of a sword. So any of that stuff you see nowadays, that was the source of that. The Witcher, any of that crap, all that's stolen from Elric. And the fascinating thing about Elric was this was a character that you really kind of liked and you rooted for, but he did horrible things. He ends up killing like everybody he's ever close to, and that really opened my eyes that there was a different way to tell these sort of engaging speculative stories, without falling into the normal hero tropes. Um, and then when I was about 12, I think I read a book called Grendel, which is by an author named John Gardner. And it too kind of turned things on its ear because it told the traditional story of Beowulf. And of course, Grendel was Beowulf's monster, is the ogre that attacks the settlement, the battle hall in the middle of the night. But it was told from Grendel's point of view. And so, Beowulf's just this, hulking, brutal enemy. Grendel just kind of wants to be left in peace, and this guy's coming, like, searching him out to fight him. Um, so that obviously resonated with me, and I later adapted the name into my Grendel, which was, the first incarnation of Grendel had echoes of Batman, had echoes of Zorro, this kind of swashbuckling character, but he's the bad guy. And I was struck with the idea of, okay, if we're gonna do this, if we're gonna flip things on its ear, let's have the bad guy be the handsome matinee idol, and have the good guy be this horrid ogre, this bestial, violence-driven character, Um, so that's how the first incarnation of Grendel came about.
It's funny that you married this sort of lith erudite sort of character with the name that is more typically associated with the hulking
Yeah.
ogre
Yeah. Well,
character.
again, trying to flip everything on its ear, you know. Yep.
Right, right. Um, what about the look of Grendel? I mean, was there a to me it looks, I mean, and this is in with the benefit of hindsight and also when I grew up, I mean, it has a ninja quality to
Sure.
him and sort of maybe Asian influences by virtue of that. Was that conscious? Was that on your mind?
Yeah, the very first three black and whites. So this calls for a slight publishing history.
Yeah.
We did these black and whites. Uh, we didn't get much good response to the four titles that they released, except for Grendel. Everybody seemed to kind of like Grendel. But it seemed evident that black and whites weren't what the industry wanted. Again, at that point, wait just about 3 years, and everybody wanted black and white
Right.
comics. You know? So Comico made the decision to move into color publishing. And they had a book lined up, a color book lined up by a fellow named Chuck Dixon, who later went on to great writing renown on his own, who was doing a book with his wife at the time, no longer married to her, but it was called Evangeline, and it was about a set in the far future and about an assassin nun, a nun who works for the Vatican as an assassin. So that was going to be in color. And at that point, I don't know if it's still this way, but at that point, it behooved any publisher to do what they called gang printing, which meant that the printing press was so wide it could fit two books side by side, two reams of paper running at the same time. So it behooved you to do two books because it cost the exact same amount, right?
Right.
The only thing you were paying for was the raw material. The process of using the printers, which was the
Yeah.
big cost, was the same cost. So, since Grendel was the only one of the books that had gotten any positive feedback, they offered me the chance to develop a color series. And that turned out to be Mage. And at that point, Grendel hadn't sold well enough for me to want to continue it. Again, got some fan reaction and some critical reaction. I thought I was just going to leave it behind. Started doing Mage, got several issues into Mage, and Mage started to get some critical reaction, some fan reaction. And then I started to hear from people saying, "Hey, whatever happened to Grendel? You just dumped that. You just dropped it midstream." And so I decided to relaunch it as a backup feature in Mage. And by doing that, I was regulated to having 4 pages per issue. So I had to come up with a way to get as much or close to as much story across in 4 pages as I had been doing in 20 plus pages. That's when I stumbled upon the idea of doing it in the kind of illustrated book fashion, which is what it eventually became. What was later collected as Devil by the Deed, the first Grendel story arc. It was written as if it was a history book written by a historian looking back on Grendel. So the events of Grendel's life have already taken place, and this historian, this criminologist, journalist, is examining what went down. And it just it was really uh, just invigorating. Falling upon that way of telling the story was very invigorating. It was completely different than Mage, so I was getting to do two different things in the same book at the same time, which really let me kind of like stretch my creative wings. And it was a fun way to play with layout and minimalism insofar as what I could and couldn't show. I couldn't really have panels going from sequential panels from panel to panel. I had to do everything more as an illustrated book with blocks of text floating around on each page. And that's the publishing history. Let me backtrack just a second and say that those early black and whites, yes, were very influenced by anime. The reason being, I had kind of just seen anime. Anime wasn't all over the damn place like it is now. It was a very
Yeah.
rare thing. Like when we got our hands on various uh, 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 VHS tapes that of an anime show or movie or everything. It was just like, wow, look at this. This doesn't look anything like American animation.
Yeah.
So those early ones, yes, of course, I had the the great big eyes and the tiny little mouth on most of the characters and everything. I kind of quickly realized this isn't really my forte. I'm just fucking around here. I need to like leave this behind and move on to, a kind of something that's more comfortable for me. But I messed around with it for a short while.
Well, I think, what strikes me about the design for Grendel and the same for Mage is kind of I don't want to say maybe stark, but the simplicity
Yeah.
of those
Yep.
costumes. I
Yep.
mean, again, ask this of others, but I think it really benefits a character to have such an iconic but simple look, so it's just very identifiable. Was that in your mind when you were creating
Yeah,
both
yeah,
of these
and that
characters?
that sort of stuff always appealed to me, in both writing and in art,
Mm,
why say it in 100 words if you can say it in 10?
right.
Why have, 250 little scratchy lines if you can do it in 3 or 4 lines to just as effectively?
Yeah.
I mean, of course, amongst the comics community, Alex Toth is the grandmaster of this style of art. But of course, before him, there were various comic strip artists, Milt Caniff and some of the greats from those days. But yeah, I've always been attracted to simplicity. Keep it brief, get to the point.
Yeah.
Uh, don't fill everything with a ton of detail and everything because part of what appeals to me about comics is the storytelling aspect. And for my money, when you open a book, there's a 2-page spread, and there's a million lines, there's a million things going on. The story drops dead for that. You stand there and you scan and scan and scan, and I guess you're taking in some kind of story details. But the same doesn't happen in a film. For instance, if you look at the first Star Wars, uh, there's a simplicity to, by this I mean Chapter 4, A New Hope. There's simplicity to things. It's set out in a desert planet for the most part. Even the
Yeah.
space battles are just the big lone Death Star and a ragtag group of ships going in to fight it. Then you compare that to some of the prequels, where there's space battles where there's just ships everywhere and everything's
Yeah.
coming at you a mile a minute. You are not taking in all those details. It's just zipping right past you. Um, and that's a difference. You don't get to slow down with a film. Sure, you can go back and watch it again and again and again and again and again. But
Right.
the experience of it happening to you right then and there, you're at the mercy of the film director, the film editor, who gives it to you in the fashion that they want. This is the difference between comics and film. In comics, you, the reader, are in control of how you consume it. You turn the pages.
Yeah.
And I remember seeing a lecture Will Eisner gave at DC one time, and he was talking about this and how, as a comic book storyteller, what you really want to do is take that choice away from people. You want to make everything so compelling and so streamlined that they turn the page without thinking about it.
Right.
And again, when you get these giant 2-page spreads that are just filled with detail, everybody slows down, everybody stops. I do too. You want to look at all this shit that the artist has put on there. But that's not what I want to get across in my comics. I want to pick you, the reader, up and throw you through the story.
Right. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I can totally get that point. It's distracting if your main point is to tell a story and you want visually for the reader to get the information they need immediately so that you can get to the propulsiveness of the actual
Yep.
narrative.
Yep. Yep.
So that makes sense. I was thinking when you gave Star Wars as an example, I was thinking of the first Superman, right? Compared to almost all of the movies that came after it. Maybe Batman is, the first 89 one is comparable, but they don't spend time on him putting on each boot and with loving detail and the whole and
Right. He
gear
falls out a
and things
window and he
like
just
that.
changes so fast.
He just changes and it's just iconic. It's
Yeah.
the lines are clean. It's
Yep.
just
Yep.
exactly what it should be. And so you're not distracted by, oh, we got to see how the costume is different and how he puts it on. Just go with it. You know what I mean? Yeah. So
It's one of the things
I'm
I
with you
love
there.
about the two Denis Villeneuve Dune films is
Right.
that they're not full of tech porn. They're not full of
True.
they're not full of like when you see a spaceship, the camera doesn't like, sexily linger across it. It's just
Right.
there, it's part of the world, and the shot moves on,
Yeah. Yeah.
and that really accents the world building in my mind.
Makes sense. I wanted to ask you a little bit about the early when you were balancing Mage and Grendel, and this is probably because of just logistics of making them both. But the first Grendel, the series after Mage had started, obviously you're doing just the writing, not the art. Is that right?
You talking about the Panda Brothers run?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, the Christine Spar run. Okay, well that happened after Mage had finished, both Mage and
Oh,
the
okay.
backup.
Okay.
And the way that came about is uh, Mage wrapped up, and Comico came to me and they said, "We want to turn Grendel into a monthly." And I said, "Well, that's going to be hard. I just killed him." Uh,
Right.
so I started to think, is there a way I can do this? Is there a way I can change things up? And here again, I drew inspiration from something I liked as a kid, Lee Falk's The Phantom comic strip, where in the contemporary Adventures of the Phantom, he's the 23rd in a line of phantoms stretching back hundreds of years. It's handed off from father to son. So I thought, can I do the same thing with Grendel? Can I just have Grendel become different people?
Right.
And so that's the direction I went with it. At the same time, when Mage wrapped up, I was pretty young, 25, and I was getting all sorts of accolades, and lots of people were patting me on the back and wanting to be my buddy. And and everybody, was leading me to believe that I was doing everything exactly right. And luckily, I was smart enough at that stage to be suspicious of that and think that can't be right. I'm just a pup. I don't know anything yet. I need to set challenges for myself. I need to try new things. I need to not get locked into a rut. So I figured if I was going to change up Grendel, I would try to write for other artists, something I had never done before. And not only would that change Grendel, but it would change the visual look of Grendel as well. And ultimately, I continued that into changing it. Every time Grendel changed, we changed artists, and we really tried to change the storytelling format and style and everything. But uh, but yeah, it was an effort to make sure I stayed fresh within myself, and not become stale, and not fall into tropes. Um, I people always ask me, what's your favorite Grendel or what's the favorite piece of your work, and I was like, it's always the next one. The next one's the favorite. It's always just keep moving on. And I never really look back that much either. Like I don't have any of my own artwork on display in my house. I couldn't bear to look at it that closely all the time. I have other people's artwork on display in my house, but I would just focus on the one little bit of that piece that I didn't like.
Hmm.
Like, damn, you could have done that part better. Um,
We've heard that a lot before.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
your own harshest critic.
that same thing is one of the best educators, I think, in regards to comics is when you're just working on a drawing yourself, you can draw a kind of fucked up hand and you can talk yourself out of it. You can go, looks good enough. But you see 200 copies of that fucked up hand, you realize, wow, there's no denying that's not good enough. So good lessons there.
Yeah. So, but I'm curious if when you were transitioning, so up until this point, you had been writing and drawing what you wrote, or maybe you weren't even writing, you were just doing
Yep.
thumbnails because it was all in your head, whatever it was. But now all of a sudden, you're stretching a new muscle, you're writing with the express intent that you are not going to be drawing it. Was that transition difficult? And was it hard to get back the first pieces of art because they weren't yours and maybe a little not what you would have done?
In an effort to facilitate that whole process, I elected to work in what, is generally known as Marvel style. I didn't write full scripts. And for any of your viewers who don't know what a full script is, a full script will say page one, and it'll break it down panel
Yeah.
by panel. It'll say what happens. It'll already have all the copy there, all the captions, all the word balloons. It might even describe the design of the page. It might describe size of panels, that sort of thing. I decided I didn't want to do that, that if I was going to collaborate with an artist, I wanted it to be a real collaboration. So I wrote a plot, which was to say, page one, here's what happens. And I might throw a line of dialogue in there, on the odd occasion, but it certainly didn't have the dialogue in any sort of complete sense. And part of that was to, again, as I said, facilitate it, to not get too fixed in my head what I pictured it being, because that's not why I was doing this. It shouldn't be what I pictured it being. And additionally, I kind of had a moral outlook on it. It's like, well, I can draw. If I want that kind of control, I should draw it. Why am I getting somebody else to draw it? That's just fucking lazy, you know? What I want is to collaborate. So yeah, stuff would come back and it wasn't quite how I imagined it. And there again, that would challenge me to figure out how I was going to make my words fit on these pictures, which were brand new to me. And that too was invigorating. It set me on fire. It's great.
Yeah. I can imagine it's different, certainly than what had come before, and
Yeah.
sort of being on your own to being much more, I guess, collaborative. But like you said, yeah, I can also see how it would be energizing,
Mhm.
because you're seeing different aspects of something that you're creating rather than, what you had in your head, and that can be different in a good way.
Oh, it was
Um,
totally great. Yeah. I mean,
yeah,
it was, I don't even say rare. It was almost non-existent that some stuff would come back and I was just flummoxed or like, oh God, this isn't what I wanted at all.
yeah,
Uh, and we pushed it even to the point of the ninth issue. So the Panda Brothers did this 12 issue run, and the ninth issue, I decided I wanted to push it even farther in the fact that it was going to be a silent issue. There would be a caption on the first page that was the first half of a sentence, and a caption on the last page that would be the last half of that sentence. And the rest was the character Christine Spar, in the character of Grendel. This is where we first realized that she has just gone off the deep end, that she's crazed with violence and vengeance, and she tracks this cop that's been harassing her. She tracks him, terrorizes him, and ultimately kills him. And in fact, the captions say, as to the case with Dominic Riley, that's page one. Then you go through this entire horrible thing of her tracking him and killing him. And the last page says, eventually I killed him, you know. And for that one, I didn't even break it down into pages. I just wrote for the Panda Brothers, here's what happens. One big long document. You guys make this fit into that many pages. It's all, the cinema's all on you here.
yeah.
And boy, they took that and ran that challenge and ran with it. They loved it.
That's awesome. So of course you've done other work other than Mage and Grendel, and primary among some of your other publishers are DC and Dynamite. And I noticed a little bit of a pattern as I was looking for some of the characters you've worked on. They're very pulpy, right? So you have
Yes, they are.
The Shadow, the Spirit, Green Hornet, Zorro, all of these,
It's all guys in like cloak-like outfits and hats.
yeah. I mean, it's all these, pulp adventures.
Yeah. Yeah, I have
Well,
I have a real
tell me
affinity.
about that. Why it's
I just have a real
where's that
affinity for that
connection?
stuff. Real affinity for that stuff in the same way that I have a real affinity for the very earliest comic book stories. Sure, I like Silver Age Supermans, that kind of thing, but boy, those early Golden Age things, when they are so directly inspired by the pulps that came before them, and the comic book tropes aren't locked in place yet. These guys are just kind of making this up and figuring shit out as they go along. Um, that stuff really appeals to me because it's very unfettered, not locked into any sort of traditions. And my fascination with the pulps, I kind of directly attribute to the Shadow. I was about 12 years old when I first saw the ad in DC Comics for their upcoming Shadow series, which was, of course, famously begun by Denny O'Neil and Mike Kaluta. Just this
Yeah.
iconic series of issues that they did together. Uh, the Shadow stood out because he was using a gun in the ads. Comic book heroes didn't use guns in those days, and that was like, wow, what's up with this guy? And so just around the same time that DC released that, you could get. Let me backtrack just a touch. My parents, as I said, were slightly older, so they dated back to the days of radio, and they would tell me about listening to the Shadow and those kind of programs on their radio. And at that time, you could get old Shadow radio adventures on LP vinyl. So I was buying a bunch of those and listening to those. And just around the same time, a paperback book publisher called Pyramid Books started to release all the old original pulp novels with these brand new gorgeous covers by comic artist Jim Steranko, painted covers by Jim Steranko. So in the space of like 2 or 3 years now, I got like a 1, 2, 3 punch of the Shadow and just hit me hard, and I just became very involved in that stuff. Um, Predating that, I was a giant Edgar Rice Burroughs fan. I read all of the Tarzan books and all the John Carter books, most of the Carson of Venus stuff. Those were all, of course, all originally published in pulp magazines. So I got a decent amount of pulp in my DNA, and I just have never let go of it. Um, in fact, my brilliant artist and co-collaborator on my current project of Dracula graphic novels, Kelley Jones describes my writing as literary pulp. And I
I mean,
said,
that's high
"Yeah,
praise.
I'll take that. That's a great description.
Uh,
I think that nails me pretty good."
yeah, I'd say that's exactly what you're going for. So, yeah, you nailed it. And especially someone who's, uh, illustrating from your writing.
Yeah, yep,
That's got to feel gratifying that
yep,
he's getting the message.
yep.
I want to ask you about a couple of other books that sort of jump out from that are not within that kind of pulpy wheelhouse, and how they came about. And one of them was The Demon,
Hmm.
and strays a little, it has mythological elements, which I think is
Hmm.
also kind of a theme of your work, but strays quite far from the street level pulpy heroes that we've been talking about. How did that come about, and what is your like connection to the Demon? Why did you want to do that project?
So I came to Kirby kind of late. Again, I couldn't really get my hands on Marvel comics regularly when I was growing up. So when Kirby was in the heyday of his FF and Thor and those sort of things, I wasn't really there for that. But once he moved to DC and those line of books he did for DC, the New Gods, which mystified the hell out of me. I couldn't figure out what the hell was going on, and that was very attractive to me. That again, the mystery was just so engaging. Um, the problem with the New Gods is, again, it was spread out over 4 books. There were three new. There was New Gods, Mr. Miracle, Forever People, and then it bled into Jimmy Olsen as well. And I couldn't get stuff with regularity. But then Curry did the Demon, and I could get those, and those wrapped up in each issue. And it had this Jekyll and Hyde sort of, which again is a pulpy sort of thing in and of itself.
Yeah,
This Jekyll and Hyde character who turned into a monster, and and then Omac. I just absolutely adored Omac. So all of that, and Commandy. So all of that kind of middle period DC Kirby stuff really had a firm grip on me. And then several years later, in I want to say like a Detective Annual and maybe an issue of Batman Family, uh, Michael Golden drew two demon short stories. I think one was a demon by himself and one that was a demon teaming up with somebody. And he just drew him so dark and mysterious and shadowy. It was very, very appealing. And then, of course, in the pages of Swamp Thing, Alan Moore had the demon show up and gave him this rhyming way of talking and made him seem like he was a certain class of demon, that there was a hierarchy in hell and there were rhymers, and boy, I
right.
really loved that. Um, and I was at a convention in Atlanta, and this is in the days when conventions were small enough that they took all the guests out to dinner on Saturday night, all at once, because there were only, what, 15 of us, something like that.
Right, right.
And I happened to get seated next to Dick Giordano, who was editor-in-chief of DC at the time. And Dick really had his finger on the pulse of all comics. You know, he paid attention to the indies. He knew stuff, so he knew Mage and he liked it. And we proceeded to get kind of sloshed together. And he invited me up to. I was living in Philadelphia at the time, and he invited me up to New York to give him a pitch. Like, you know, there's something some of our characters you like. They were looking to do new, you know, after the success of Alan and this new approach to Swamp Thing and renovating characters. They were looking for more of that. So the first thing I took him was a pitch for a new Batgirl. And the gist of that was this was when Geraldine Ferraro was Mike Dukakis's running mate. She was running for vice president.
Yep.
So I had Barbara Gordon running for vice president. And somewhere along the campaign trail, there was a series of murders, and she had this cop who was her bodyguard, who she basically trains to be the new Batgirl, and uh, that was the gist of it. And so I took that to Dick, and Dick said, "Well, no, unfortunately, we just gave Alan Moore the okay to cripple Barbara Gordon in the Killing
I was
Joke."
wondering what, yeah, that must have
Yeah,
been right
so they
around
want
then.
that idea. He said, "But what else do you like?" I said, "Well, I like the demon." He said, "Oh, perfect. I love the demon. Bring me something with the demon." So I went home and worked up this idea. I started looking through some books and I found a medieval print. So are you aware of where the demon comes from? The look for the demon
No.
comes from a Sunday episode of Prince Valiant. There's a sequence where Val is trying to scare some dudes, and he's going to pose as a goblin or a creature of
Yeah.
the night, and he kills a duck and skins it and turns it inside out and puts it on as a mask. So the demon's like fringed ears there are the duck's feet, and then there's two pegs sticking out of the top. I mean, if you go and look at it, he's even yellow. I mean, it's clear
Yeah.
that's where Kirby took it from.
Wow.
But in doing this demon research that I was doing, I found a medieval print of the demon Bilal, who is one of the Dukes of Hell, and he looked exactly like Etrigan, like same look. So I concocted this whole thing about how Bilal was Etrigan's father, and took it from there. So that's all of that came about.
Yeah. Very cool. Another one that sticks out at me just because it was right when I worked at Marvel for 2 years, around 2000 to 2002. And you may recall around that time, it was post bankruptcy, and it was like Marvel Knights, Ultimate Marvel, they're throwing a lot of stuff against the wall, bringing in a lot of independent creators. And so I see here, one of my favorite series from that time is Ultimate Marvel Team Up. And you got to be the first collaborator in the first issue of that, which was Spider-Man and Wolverine. I'd love to know if you can just tell me about that time and if I don't assume the call was from Bendis.
Yeah,
Um,
very strange thing about my career. Marvel has never showed any interest in me at all. They've never offered me a gig. They've never sought me out or solicited me to work for them ever. And
wow.
I can't really figure out why. But I'm busy enough, that I don't really care. Uh,
Yeah.
but Bendis was always a big fan of mine. I had written an introduction for one of his books. What was it? It wasn't Torso.
Goldfish.
Yeah, it was Goldfish. Yeah. Uh, and uh, and so he called me and he said because he had done Ultimate Marvel or Ultimate Spider-Man, and I think there was maybe one other. Was there one or two other titles in the Ultimate line out at that point? And he said,
Yeah,
"Hey, they're
maybe
going to do
X-Men.
Ultimate Marvel. Yeah, it's probably X-Men. They're going to let me do Ultimate Marvel Team Up, and I get to invite in all my favorite indie creators, and I'm calling you first. And would you want to do it?" I said, "Well, do I get issue number one? And can we make it Spider-Man and Wolverine? We're going to go for it. Go for the gold,
Yeah, yeah,
And he said, "Yeah." So I mean, that was interesting. I feel like again that sort of straight up superhero stuff isn't really my forte.
yeah.
But it was fun playing with that. That was a fun gig.
I thought it was an interesting. I don't know. It was just an interesting concept. Is to first of all to have a sort of a team up book, sort of harkening back to 70s, 80s, but also to have bring in people that are not usually associated with,
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yep.
Marvel or maybe even mainstream comics and
Mhm.
do that stuff. And so I was very happy to see your name is on the first issue. And there were subsequent issues which were very cool too with others. So I just curious how that came about. Um, one last one before I do want to turn to Dracula a little bit, even though you may be sort of Draculaed out from a lot of the interviews you've done, but
My wife is
is
Dracula out.
yeah, okay, I can get it.
I'm
Um,
certainly out.
is Trinity, which
Mhm.
was your big book around Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, 2003. Um, so again, you've done mostly offbeat kind of characters at that point, although you've done Batman, but again, I fit him into this, kind of pulpy category. What made you want to take on what may be known as the Holy Trinity at DC and do like sort of a, this bigger palette kind of book?
I got the offer from Bob Schreck, who was one of the big editors over there at that point.
Hmm.
He said, pitch me something, and I said, well, how about something? Let's just go really big. And I will point out, I'm the one that came up with the term Trinity. Um, uh, if you look at all the stuff I've done for DC, it is always set very early in a character's career.
Yeah.
So Sandman Mystery Theater was starting, the Golden Age Sandman all over with a whole new outlook, a Vertigo specific outlook. The two Batman series I did, Batman and the Mad Monk and Batman and the Monster Men, very early in Batman's career. Trinity, the first time the three of them hook up together. Part of that is I don't want to have to deal with all just all the excess continuity. I want to dig in deep to what I like about the core of these characters and not have to include all the other shit. When I look at Batman nowadays, I mean, first of all, I could go down a rabbit hole, man.
There's a lot of him.
I'm kind of a firm advocate that I think most pop culture characters work best in the time, place, and technology that they were originally created. Batman today is not a Dark Knight detective. He's a paramilitary character.
Yeah, for
He
sure.
drives a tank. He's covered head to toe in Kevlar. He has all these, weapons. There's not much like jumping out of the darkness and scaring people anymore.
The
Similarly,
absolute version looks like he is a tank, by the
yeah,
way.
right,
And I
exactly.
know
Yeah.
it's sort of like an alternate version,
Yeah, I
but
mean,
still.
that's even more like that's a character called Batman, but that's not Batman.
Yeah.
Similarly, like James Bond for me really only works in the 60s. I want the Cold War paranoia. I want the sexism. I want the racism. It's what makes that character what he is.
Thin
Uh,
ties.
Imperfect as it is. The shadow only works in that time period. Number one, he only works in a time and place where every man on the street was wearing a hat. Because otherwise, like, well, who's the bozo in the hat? And it
Right.
only works in a time and place when cities still had shadows, because they
Yeah.
don't anymore. There are no shadowy alleyways. All the alleyways are lit up. Everything's lit up. There's lights everywhere. It's lit up, like a pinball machine. Superman, the whole thing about, is this enough to disguise somebody? Well, in a time and a place where everybody wasn't photographed all the time. My parents are from that era before they hit like the 1960s. I have like three photographs of each of them over the
Yeah.
course of 45 years. I
Right.
mean, um, you have to figure Superman wouldn't stick around to be photographed. He would do his thing and zip off. So nobody ever gets a really good look at it. Um, so where was I? How did I get down this rabbit hole? I can't. What were we
We
talking
were
about?
talking Trinity, and
Oh,
you're
Trinity.
saying
Yeah. So I like
that
cutting
early in
down
their
to I
careers.
like cutting
Yeah.
down to the core of things. And when I look at Batman, he's supposed to be this lone avenger of the night. There's like what 30 people in the Batman family now? I mean, there's like how many Robins, and there's the Red Hood, and there's the spoiler, and how many Batgirls, and It's like, what's he running an orphanage? Is he, it kind of, it depresses me that there's got to be somebody in a cloak leaping off every other building in Gotham City, right? Um, and Superman too. Once you start introducing Supergirl and Superboy, and all of a sudden, if you have 15 characters that have Superman's powers, then he's not Superman. Then he's ordinary man.
Right,
I mean,
right.
so I like it when these characters are by themselves, doing their thing, only the core of what makes them what they are. So that's why I keep gravitating to those kind of stories for when I get the chance to play with those characters.
Hmm. When you, how do you choose your projects? And also, as a second part, how do you choose when those projects are going to be you as a writer versus you as a writer artist?
Well, it that just kind of happens organically. What role I'm going to take. I know whether I should draw it or not. I know what my drawing strengths are. For instance, Dracula. Wait, let's get into Dracula here. I knew I
Yep.
was not going to draw Dracula. I'm not. That's not my thing. Uh, and Kelley Jones and I have known each other for decades, and we always kind of threatened to work together someday. And we both knew we wanted that to be something big, something significant, not just a little one-off, of some kind. And several years ago, I had posted something, and Kelley hit me back with that same echoing line, "We really got to work together someday." And I had been brewing on this Dracula idea for a long time. And I contacted him. I said, "So are you serious now? Because I think I got the idea that's perfect for both of us." And he thought I was going to say something Batman. And when I told him it was Dracula, he just about shit himself, and he was so happy. And but I knew that was not for me to draw. And oh my God, wait do you see book two? This is just literally, this whole series is the book that Kelley was born to draw. And that's he's already got a lot of A game efforts in his past. This just knocks them all right out of the park, man.
Yeah, book one was fantastic. So if you're saying book two is even better, I'm
And
I'm there for it.
I just gave him the script for book three as well. So
Sweet.
yep.
I'd love to know your approach to this entire project because I happen to be, over the course of a long time, reading Bram Stoker's original Dracula novel. And there are parts I like, and there's a vast middle, I'll put it this way, that is quite slow, quite Dracula-less.
Well, once he gets to London, you never see him at all.
Correct.
Hardly. He shows up a little bit once they kind of track him down.
I- I'm towards the
He
now the
becomes just
end. I've
that
got
kind of
about like
sinister presence, that is
right,
haunting them more than
right, right.
a physical being.
So well, I'd love to hear in your words your approach to this, but it seems to be that you are taking pieces, concepts from the original book and blowing them out into their own chapters of Dracula's story as a character.
Yeah,
Is that the right way of
that's
thinking about
absolutely.
it? Okay.
Additionally, if you're reading Stoker's original, you know that it's epistolary. It's told in the form of journals and
Mhm.
letters and newspaper articles. There's no omniscient narrator.
Correct.
In addition to Dracula being off stage, his voice isn't there. The one voice missing is Dracula himself, and that makes him
True.
more sinister and more mysterious. Yes,
Right.
but enough time's gone by. I think we want to know what Dracula has to say for himself. And yeah, I'm taking. There's Stoker was very good at creating a mysterious setting and a mysterious character. So there's little bits, especially in the scenes in the castle at the beginning. There's little bits that are so evocative and create this kind of like tantalizing, I wonder where that came from sort of vibe. For instance, in book one, Van Helsing mentions twice in the novel that when he was alive, Dracula attended something called the Scholomance, which is a
Right.
Romanian, an Eastern European legend about this seminary for the dark arts that Satan himself hosts way up in the mountains, and it uh, each the tenure of each session is 7 years. He takes on 10 scholars at a time, and at the end of that 7 years, he keeps one of them. That's you don't really know what that means, but he keeps one of them. And it always struck me as like, how come nobody's ever done anything with that? That's such an evocative, like, wellspring of ideas about, how did Dracula attend this
Be-
school of sorcery taught by Satan?
right.
And I in the book, he seems so significantly more powerful than any other vampire you see. The other vampires you see aren't many, but and they're all women, I will point out. But they are mainly just creepy crawler predators, nighttime predators. They can turn into a mist and go through small cracks to enter places. But Dracula can control the weather, and he can transform into animals, and he can command animals, and he's got all these other necromantic powers. And in our version, that's because he learned that at the Scholomance. So he's a trained sorcerer in addition to being this badass fucking vampire. Additionally, I felt the onus was on me to come up with a very special way that he became a vampire. I thought he can't just get bitten by another vampire. That's boring. That's ordinary. That doesn't make him the vampire.
Right.
Um, so yeah, I am trying to fill in all these little gaps. The second book is called The Brides, and one of the most indelible scenes in the book is when Harker is at the castle in Transylvania, and these three vampiric women, who are never actually called the brides in the book, but you're certainly led to believe they are at least his concubines or consorts, um, appear and go to prey on him, and they are so evocative. They show up in like almost every film adaptation of the book, and they're only there for less than 10 paragraphs. And there's not really much about them. There's not much to distinguish the three of them, one from the other. And so that was our challenge in book two. Is like, how does
Mhm.
he get each one of the brides? And who are they as women before they become part of his harem? And each one of them had to be distinctly different from the other and have a distinctly different reason that their persona attracted him and that he chose them. And that was a blast. That was an absolute. This it's one of the most intensive things I've ever written, and also one of the funnest things I've written in years.
Yeah.
It's just again a blast. Kelley too. Kelley just is beside himself with how much fun he's having on this.
Um, yeah, when you get to ask like just something that people have probably asked before, but you get to answer it, like
Yeah,
the brides. The basic question is, what's their deal?
yeah.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. And
But you
we
you
learned with
move on
each.
so when you're reading the book or even watching the movies, it moves on so quickly to,
Yep,
the
yep,
next set piece or what
yep,
have you that you
yep.
you don't get to stay in that moment. And the same thing with the Scalamancer.
Now,
Uh,
one thing I will say about our portrayal, this in no way echoes any sort of modern concepts of equality in marriage. He's Lord of the domain. He's Lord of everything in his
sure.
mind. There is
Right.
no
Right.
equality in his mind.
Yeah.
He's it. Um, but kind of much to his surprise, even though he has conquered his entire life, he's been a conqueror of all sorts. Uh, the real Vlad Sepesh, never had any children. He was married twice, but never had any children. So these are the first things he's ever created.
Mm,
And so he finds himself kind of beholden to he thinks that they're just there to please him, but he has to maintain them.
yeah.
He feels
Yeah.
an obligation to maintain them. So that becomes as much of a trap as it is an indulgence.
Yeah. Both children in some ways and consorts, I guess.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting sort of way to play with the relationships between the characters. I want
And
to
then
ask,
and then book one covered about a decade. Book two is going to cover centuries and will lead us right up to the point where he decides to go to England. And
okay,
and, and what leads to that? What makes him decide to do that?
right,
We
right,
we find out.
yeah. Interesting. All right, I'm very
Of course,
excited. And there's going to be
That's never explored in the book. He's got this plan.
no,
We know he's after fresh blood, but what
right.
led to that, you know?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, exactly. After especially after being in Transylvania for, presumably centuries, right?
four centuries, yeah.
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 It's like, oh, let's see what's going on over in England. Um, one thing I wanted to ask about the visuals, and obviously Kelley Jones is, hitting on all cylinders, but what I found interesting in the first book also were the colors and the color scheme by Jose Villarrubia, which is much brighter
Ah.
than one would expect from a gothic vampire tale, right?
Leading into this, I said to Kelley, I fucking hate the way people color you. People always look at your stuff and they think, oh, he's dark and moody. I'm going to color it dark and moody. And the point is, no, he's already done the dark and moody. You have to be able to see his wonderful lines and all the shadows he draws in there. He's done that part already. Don't
Right.
lay dark and moody over top of it. It just gets muddy, you know? And so when Jose came on, and we specifically thought of Jose because of the restorative work he had just done on the Rights and Swamp Thing stuff for DC, and the same thing he's doing for the Corbin Library for Dark Horse,
Yeah.
both of which bright and vibrant. And I said to him, Jose, look, we want this to feel like old comics. We want that vibrancy. And specifically, I described to him my thoughts about coloring Kelley, and I pointed him to two different films. Uh, uh, Suspiria by Dario Argento and Black Sabbath by Mario Bava, both of which are lit up bright as pinball machines, and yet they're both totally spooky. And boy, he took it and ran with it. He got it in spades, and it just really every time he would turn in colors, Kelley would just be like, "Oh my God, I love this so much. It looks my stuff looks so good."
Yeah, I'm excited to see more. That's what really I mean, first of all, the concept of again blowing out these little moments into bigger, explanations and narratives was one thing, and obviously Kelley's art, but the colors really sort of drove it home as a package, as something really different because I'm not telling you anything different. There are a lot of Dracula things out there. There's a lot of stuff going on, and
Yep,
so
yep, yep.
not only are there a lot of comic projects, of course, and graphic projects, and more by the day. So you have to sort of separate yourself from those. But then even in this subgenre of Dracula and vampire tales, I think you've hit on like a lot of things that really set this project apart. Um, so
Well,
you have
the key was to want to stick religiously close to the text, but not do another adaptation.
not
There's
be
a mil
literal,
yeah, there's a million adaptations.
right?
You are not going to see an adaptation of the novel. You're
Yeah,
not going to see the events of the novel. You're going to see around the events of the novel.
right, right. Almost inspired by the events of the novel, but not, but still, yeah, yeah, filling in, I guess, almost
Yeah,
the
yeah.
events of the novel. And the intention is 6 books.
For right now, we have an idea of something cool for yet another volume, and we have to wait and see when I get to the end of book four if I have somewhere else I can take it.
Okay,
And narratively, we won't do it unless there's good ideas.
absolutely.
Yeah.
I think I read some misinformation when this was all gestating that it was going to be something like 12 volumes, and I'm like, whoa.
Yeah. I mean, that'd be great if I can come up with that many. We'll
Yeah,
see.
yeah, yeah. No, I'm
Yeah.
totally happy. I mean, do as many
Four
as
is where it stands right now.
yeah, four's
That'll
great.
if it only ends up being that, that'll be fine.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. Looking forward to 2, 3, and 4. So very exciting. What, if anything else, and I'm sure this is pretty much consuming, but do you have going on that we can look forward to?
Uh, there's a Grendel series coming out from Dark Horse that's coming out in 4 issues per year. It's a 16 ultimately a 16 chapter story, so it'll cover 4 years. Dark Horse, that's the way they like to do it. 4 issues, then the trade, 4 issues, then the trade, 4 issues, then the trade. That's called Devil's Crucible. So the first part of that, which is Devil's Crucible Defiance, is already out. The 4 issues are out. So next year is when the second part will come out. Between those, and I'm writing and drawing that. My son's coloring it. Uh, Between all that, it keeps me pretty busy. So that's,
I can imagine.
yep.
And we're back. Love talking to Matt. He's got a lot going on. I really love his and Kelley Jones's interpretation of Dracula and how they kind of get into the minutia of the book and blow it out in a spectacular fashion. So can't wait to see the last two books in that series and everything else Matt is working on. So thank you for being on the show, Matt Wagner. Thank you all out there for listening, for viewing, rating, reviewing, and subscribing. We have at least one more episode for you this week, probably just the one. So we'll see you Friday. Peace.